Sharpe, and this is Tea in 21, and I'm back today for episode 4 with my good friend Craig Wilde. Today's episode is all about giving birth.
Oh, my goodness me. We will find out, was Laura too posh to push? I think that's what we could prefix it with. Is Laura too posh to push? I know her well, so probably. Anyway, so yes, we are. And I'm here as your foil to help hopefully elicit from you all these nuggets of information about your pregnancy, birthing journey. So we are going to enter the birthing canal together. So
That sounds delightful.
it sounds
Craig.
delightful. Anyway, I wonder if there's a minibar. Where are we at today? So yes, we last week in our last episode, we talked about all of the complications. Yes, didn't we? We talked about
the additional diagnosis during my pregnancy with Lucy having a heart condition.
So far we've gone from conception and with the aid of now what do they call those people again?
Reflexologists. And it was definitely John that got me pregnant.
Yes, just reiterating that. And Teen21. There was something I was going to ask you actually is so for those of people out there who go, it's about a girl has a daughter who has Down syndrome. So why Teen21?
So the medical term for Down syndrome is trisomy 21, because you get 3 copies of the chromosome 21 in the gene when you would normally have 2. I think that's the right way to describe it. So I came up with I think the two of us maybe came up with the name Tea in 21 with Laura Sharpe because it just was a nice play on the T21.
Yeah, and we do like tea.
Well, I'm from Yorkshire.
So am I.
And I don't drink coffee. I only drink tea. So it had to be Tea in 21.
Tea21. But today we're on the water again, just so everybody knows. But normally we'd have a brew.
Normally we'd be having a brew and having a chat.
Yeah.
And I think long term, when we've kind of worked through, the sort of the early parts of my pregnancy and having Lucy, in the long term, my plan with the podcast is to become more of a kind of sitting and having a chat about what's been going on in the last week or so.
So we can get some sort of more up-to-date insight. But this is all about that journey, and we are going to have a baby. So I want to set
John and I are going to have a baby. You and I aren't having a baby.
We're not having a baby, no. We're not.
Sorry,
I'm just getting ultimately in this journey, I get to meet somebody incredible in the form of Lucy.
Yes.
So that's the cool bit.
Yeah.
And anyway, so what I want to know is we are at what point, because I know that with women, with parents who have a Down syndrome diagnosis for their child, that there is often issues around when they should be born.
Yes.
Because, whilst I don't have children myself, I know it's 9 months gestation before one has a baby.
Yes.
But is that different for parents who are going to have a baby with Down syndrome?
Yes, it can be. So once we'd had the diagnosis of the heart condition during pregnancy, regardless of that anyway, I think we would have been having additional scans, and they keep a very, very close eye on you. So in a typical pregnancy, you have a 12-week scan and I think it's a 20-week scan, is it? I don't know because I didn't follow that path, but it's something like that.
Right.
And they'll just leave you to it until your baby decides to come out, from what I understand. But if they spot anything at all, it doesn't have to be Down syndrome, anything going on in the pregnancy that's slightly out of the ordinary, you get moved into a different unit in the hospital for all of your scans and your sort of updates and everything. You're under a different area, so you're not in with all of the other mums with without any complications. And you go pretty regularly, and they'll see you. They want to see you. I think it's a minimum of every 3 or 4 weeks.
Right.
But depending on your consultant and how you feel, you can almost dictate anything up to every week. They won't see you more than once a week unless you've got something going on and they need to see you, or you're really worried about something. Obviously, you can go in more. If you've just been in on the Tuesday and something happens on the Thursday, you can still go in.
Right.
But as far as booking appointments to see you and do scans, they ask for, ideally around every 3 or 4 weeks. But I chose every 2 weeks because that felt more comfortable to me.
Right.
So I was already in the national support group on Facebook for Down Syndrome UK, which was which their charity name is Positive About Down Syndrome, and I was in the sort of the expectant mums group, support group. It's a private Facebook group that you go into as soon as you get a diagnosis, or you might be about to get a diagnosis or not. You don't always know, but they'll let you in just to talk to other people in that group and find out about what they are. There are volunteers in that group who've been through the process and maybe have children who are 2, 3, 4, 5 years old and even older children, and they are there to support you. But then you can also chat to other mums in a very similar position to you. So that was really, really helpful. And from those discussions, I gleaned that every couple of weeks was a fair amount for me to ask for to be seen, so that we had a very close eye on that baby and we knew what was going on in there. Because children with Down syndrome often, again, there's not a lot of research around this. This is just what I've kind of gleaned from talking to people and figuring it out for myself. There seems to be a bit of an issue around the placenta sometimes, where I don't know if the child takes more than it should from you, or it's because it's struggling to develop, the placenta struggles, or something can happen where the placenta can start to fail, and that can happen quite easily with children with Down syndrome. Okay. So that's why they keep a close eye. And when you go, they give you loads of figures that make absolutely no sense, but you're told all of those figures look good. Go away, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay. And by the end of it, I started to have a vague idea what all those figures meant. And it was really about the functionality of your placenta and how much the baby was getting and how much it was needing and all the rest of it.
Because here's the thing.
And growing.
Here's the thing that you've not mentioned is, like, I know, having had loads of pals who've had babies, and I'm sure you're the same, cravings and such. Mm-hmm. So we've talked quite a lot about, like, the baby and the diagnoses and the trauma and the, all of that. But, like, did you have a craving for crab apples or something like that?
I had an unusual pregnancy, and it was to do with my hormone levels, and that's how they knew that Lucy had Down syndrome very early on, because when they do that very first test on your blood at 12 weeks, my hormone levels were all out. I didn't have morning sickness. I didn't feel pregnant.
Wow.
And I basically, until she kicked me, which was probably about week 24 or 25 at the earliest, it might have even been later than that I didn't, until that happened, even though I was seeing her on the screens, I honestly didn't think there was a baby in there.
So there's a sort of detachment there, because we're conditioned to think, I'm going to have kicking, I'm going to feel bloated, I'm going to have sickness. I'm going to have, cravings. I had some vague little cravings, but they were
I had one craving, which drove John insane, because I was just constantly asking him to go to the shop and buy these, was those Schweppes lemonade lollies. Oh. And it was a citrus craving I had, I think, and they seemed to be the only thing that would sort of calm that down. So I did have that craving, but only that one craving. And really, it might have been that I wouldn't normally eat things like that. And because I was pregnant, I just fancied something different. I don't know. But
because they say, and again, this may be apocryphal, that what you're craving is what your body's needing.
Yes.
So for example, my mother, when she had me, she said she ate loads and loads of apples, like masses of apples. We had an apple tree in our garden. Our neighbours had apples. And my mum was eating half a dozen apples. I mean, it became ridiculous. And my dad used to joke that, oh, yes, my son was the apple of my eye, and all of those dad-type jokes.
And do you hate apples? Because a lot of people say that they hate the thing that their mother craved.
I love apple crumble. And I like apple pie, and it's something I'll make. I tend to be more along the lines of a kind of Dutch apple pie.
Yeah.
Because, if you're going to have apple pie,
Really naughty version.
you must have a real naughty version.
So you don't really like apples, you just like loads of sugar with them.
I'm quite struggling. So apples, I don't tend to have them in the house. And the other thing was, my dad worked as a coal miner, and my mum used to suck on a piece of coal, which is so random.
I know, and you don't get that now, but then you did because it was available and people had coal fires and stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know, because like now, where would you get a piece of coal from?
I know.
If you were craving it, and
why
never
would
had
you
any
crave?
of those kind
Why
of
would you
cravings.
crave coal?
But maybe it's to do with the diet and the access we have to different foods and things now. Like my diet is very varied, and I don't eat a huge amount of fruit, and maybe that's where the citrus craving came from, because I don't really like fruit, so I don't really eat very much of it. But fruit and but veg and sort of and different meats and fishes and all that, I eat loads of different things. So maybe that's why I didn't really get a lot of cravings.
Because I think as well, if we go back to when I was a boy. Without being cheeky about myself or allowing others to be either. But back then, diets were different. And like for us, my father and mum grew lots of veggies. And I ate organic till I was about 10.
Yeah.
Not because I wore high-waisted pants and it was cool, because I was a hipster.
Just, that was
and it's what we did
there,
back then.
Yeah.
And we had chickens and we had pigs and all sorts. And it was just sort of a community thing. And I did a varied diet. And I think back to then and going, my dad grew maize or corn on the cob, and he grew bell peppers. And I remember kids coming from school to mine for tea, and there'd be bell peppers, and they thought that we ate alien vegetables.
What on earth is
because
this? Yeah.
the diet back in the 80s was just so different to where we are now. Pizzas were French bread and they came frozen, much like they do today, but like it was a different time and a different palate.
Yes.
Whereas today I suppose because like yourself, you eat such a varied diet that probably those cravings don't really come.
I don't know. I'd be interested to anybody that has had some crazy cravings, let us know, because
particularly
it still does happen. I just
particularly those who are experiencing a pregnancy where the child has Down syndrome, because again, if it's different, and it might not be, might not be.
I don't know. I haven't actually asked. I'll have to ask some of my friends with children
because
with Down
that
syndrome
kind
as
of
well.
idea that you have, you're pregnant and you don't know it because you're not sick,
No,
and you got to 24 weeks before you got a kick, and there's a detachment there.
Definitely there was.
And
it did feel very strange. I didn't feel how I expected to feel. And it took me quite a long time to show, because Lucy was quite small, and that was why they were constantly doing lots of scans, because they wanted to do growth scans to check what a growth was like, because, like I say, a lot of children with Down syndrome can struggle, and therefore in the womb, and therefore they do need to keep an eye and make sure, because if not, then, they'll come out very early to make sure that they can get everything they need to keep growing. But so for me, it was a slightly detached feeling, and it was, and I suppose there was a lot of stress, as we've discussed on previous episodes. There was a lot going on, and a lot of appointments, and a lot of discussion, and not all of it was positive. So that did take away from my pregnancy a little bit. But I got to a point in the pregnancy, once I started to meet other people in the community, and once I started to get my head around what was happening, and that this was happening, but it was going to be okay, whatever, we were going to be all right. I did start to enjoy it more. And I think once I did start to enjoy it more, that's where I started to be more aware that she was there in my tummy. But up to that point, I did have a bit of a detachment, but I think a lot of it was to do with the stress and not having those pregnancy hormones that you're supposed to have, so I wasn't being sick.
Were you on supplements, and were you eating any special diet or anything like that? Because I'm with a not a regular pregnancy, as you've identified, with a baby with challenges, do they say to you, oh yeah, you need to eat more of this, or you need to take these kind of supplements?
Nothing
Is there
like that at all.
anything to help that along?
Nothing like that at all. Not at all.
'Cause
so, like we said in episode 1, I went on like very strong folic acid that the doctor prescribed when I found out I was pregnant due to my age and my weight and things like that. They wanted me on lots of folic acid, and that continued throughout.
But nothing specific.
To Lucy having Down syndrome. The medical professionals around me were more focused on Lucy than me, I would say. So didn't really pay much attention to how I was, or they were very focused at the appointments. It was all about how's Lucy doing, or how's this baby doing. I don't know at what point we named her, but early on it was how's this baby doing, how's this baby growing, this baby's got this heart condition, not how are you doing, Mum or Laura, or do you need anything, or are you do you feel you're struggling with anything? They sort of make reference to it here and there, but nobody had any bright ideas or any kind of suggestions on what I could do that would help me or Lucy or anything like that. So I just went off instinct, and like I say, talking to other people and what's and that whole eating for two thing is a fallacy until quite late on.
Right.
So the last few weeks you need to up your calories. So I just sort of ate as I normally would, really, and I probably ate slightly more because, hey, I'm pregnant and I don't have to be on a calorie deficit for the first time in years. And so I enjoyed, I ate Cocoa Pops and things for the first time in years, which was great fun. Probably why I ended up with gestational diabetes, though. But
Indeed. So here's a thing. We've talked about the baby's health and the focus on that. But you just said there.
Yeah, so...
you got gestational diabetes, which is not just something that can happen to a mum who is going to have a baby with Down syndrome.
Not at all, no.
It's
anybody,
across the board.
Yeah, anybody can get it, and they test absolutely everybody. You go in and drink this horrendous, pint or 2 pints or whatever it was of this glucose drink that tastes disgusting, which all of the midwives said to me, there's no need for it to taste so disgusting. We're really sorry, but it does. They need to sort that out because it was really hard to stomach. And for anybody that has any kind of sickness issues in pregnancy, it must be awful.
Wow.
So it was really bad to do it. And then they test your blood sugar afterwards. I think you have to drink it all and then sit there for an hour or something, which is really boring. They warn you though and say bring a book or a magazine or something. So I did at least have a book with me. And yes, my sugars were still high. So I wasn't, although I was still producing insulin, my body wasn't taking that insulin on board correctly and using it correctly and bringing my sugars down. And that's really common in pregnancy, especially somebody overweight like me. That I think you are at higher risk if you're overweight and probably a certain age.
Because the other one, of course, you talked there about when the baby draws down nutrients from you through the placenta. There is something going on there that could also lead to, you've got people osteoporosis.
Yeah.
I think people who end up with all the calcium being sucked out of their bones.
Yeah.
So, and that can happen in any pregnancy.
Yeah. But they don't look at that, They don't. They'll only find that out if it happens and something happens to you. They'll figure out that's what's happened, but they're not checking for it.
Wow. No. And you would think that they were like, here's the standard test.
We know this happens, therefore. Like with the gestational diabetes, that's the standard test, but that's the only standard test you have.
Yeah. Because I know of iron deficiency, calcium deficiency, because the baby needs what the baby needs, and then you've got gestational diabetes and such. So it's part of that process. I think what I'm trying to get at is that a pregnancy is a pregnancy is a pregnancy. The only difference is that with a baby who has Down syndrome, you might not feel pregnant for that first 3, 4, 5 months because he or she may be a small baby.
Yeah.
So you've got that.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, you're not getting the signals.
Your hormones.
And your hormones are not right.
Quite right.
So you're not getting those sickness things or those crazy cravings.
But some people do.
Right.
That's the thing. It's different. It's like everything. It's different in everybody. It's not a standardized thing what I went through, because I've got friends who've got children with Down syndrome who had much more what you would call standard pregnancies that were really sick at the beginning and all that kind of thing. But the reduced movement thing is a little bit more common, I think, because the babies are either smaller or they have weaker muscles or Lucy didn't have particularly weak muscles, but she had very hypermobile joints.
Right.
So I think it was hard for her to kick me because her joints were very weak, even though her muscles weren't. So, but that's why I did start to feel kicks, because she had those muscles and they started to really work at that point, sort of 24, 25 weeks, I think. But yeah, it's just one of those things that it's different for everybody, but there are some similarities in pregnancies with children with Down syndrome than others. So yeah.
Okay. So we are at what point before the discussions go around, okay, birth? What kind of conversations did you have with your paediatrician? What were what were they saying to you would happen? Would it just be a normal delivery?
So as I've talked about before, our fetal medical consultant, Gareth Waring, who was fantastic, who unfortunately isn't still at the RVI in Newcastle. He's moved away, but he has definitely trained other people in that fetal medicine unit that are following in his footsteps. I've had that feedback. But very early on, we had a discussion around how would Lucy be born? What would you like to do? And he let me lead it, and I led it using the information that I'd got from the support group. And I said, and it's funny because me being me, had done a lot of research, spoken to quite a few different people, and Down Syndrome UK, Positive About Down Syndrome, had provided this document that was written by a hospital down south that was like a kind of, because there's a pathway in law now. Once you're born, if you have Down syndrome, there's a medical pathway that needs to be followed, and it basically makes sure that every paediatrician treats every child the same way, and they all get the same tests and all the rest of it. But pregnancy is still a bit up in the air. There's nothing in law that says if you are pregnant with a child with Down syndrome, you must have X, Y, and Z tests. You must be seen this many times. It's all a bit, well, we've got the experience of doing it this way and that seems to work. And I was worried that if I didn't go in with this document that suggested that children with Down syndrome should ideally be born slightly early before the placenta has chance to start failing, and if a child with Down syndrome has a prenatal heart diagnosis like we did, that a natural birth can be a bit trickier.
Okay,
so I had all that information. I went into the meeting and put it down on the desk in front of him and said, I want it done this way, and explain what the document said. And I said, but I've brought the document so you can go away and read it in case you don't agree with me. And he said, funny that, Laura. My experience birthing children with Down syndrome is they should come out around 37 weeks, and that's what you've just told me, and that's what we're going to do.
Okay.
And I went, oh, wow. No arguments. Cool. No, you must read this document. No fights. Nothing like I expected it to be, because I was hearing people having issues around the country.
Right.
So I was going in armed because I didn't want to have this fight. No. I was more you're doing what I say. We're not having a discussion about it. But in actual fact, I didn't even need to do that. Because
one of the things you just mentioned there about placenta failure. So what does that look like? Does that mean it fails and then the pregnancy, like they try to come the normal...
yes, So
your waters break and you're on.
Yeah, as the placenta starts to fail, then generally, from what I understand,
so
I'm no medical expert,
but they fail earlier.
They can fail earlier
because they're triggered to fail like normal at 9 months.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know what. Again, I've not seen any research that backs this up, but it's more of a kind of a word of mouth thing that this seems to happen. And like I say, he had that experience himself, dealing with people that had prenatal diagnosis. His recommendation was either to be induced or a section. And he said, when I told him what I wanted to do, that I wanted to have a section, and it wasn't because I'm too posh to push, mister. It's because Lucy had this prenatal heart diagnosis where I felt that because she had a complete AVSD, which is a very major heart defect, it felt like it was the fairest thing to do rather than push her through pushing
Because she'll have that trauma, and you don't want to put the child through trauma.
I didn't want to put her under any undue stress trying to come out naturally when I'd already been told, well, you're too overweight and you're too old to have a water birth, and now you've got all these complications with this child having Down syndrome. You're not having the type of birth you wanted in the first place anyway. I'd already been told that before I'd even had any tests, that I wasn't eligible for a water birth.
Okay.
Which was nice. But, you know, these things, they have and again, you know, I've learned a lot. At the time, I was very offended. But now I understand why, because I would be too high risk in that situation
totally.
that something could go wrong. And again, they weren't forcing me. They were just really pushing me against having a water birth. And then once I knew that was kind of out of the question, it was like, well, how am I going to get this baby out of me? And it just made sense, really, for me personally. But it is still a very personal thing. And Dr. Gareth Waring did say, you can be induced at 37 weeks. You don't have to have a section, Laura. It's entirely up to you. And I chose to have a section. It was in my, you know, I was able to make that decision, which was nice. And that's what I decided to do. Well, that's what John and I decided to do, to be fair. We did discuss it, and we both agreed it was the safest and, you know, simplest way to do it without coming across any complications and needing an emergency section.
So, a date is set. And what would it look like? Did they tell you this is what your delivery is going to look like? Because is it a delivery because of Lucy's complications and Lucy's diagnoses in general? Is that a different delivery procedure to what your average child would experience?
Yes, slightly. So I think if you have a planned section, it's for a reason, usually. So whether it's previous birth complications or whatever it might be, there probably are reasons for it. And whatever those reasons are kind of dictates how that birth will look and who'll be in the room and that kind of thing. The funny thing with me was the date was set early on at 37 weeks, bang on. But then as I got further into the pregnancy and got even more knowledge, I found out that actually, you know, up to 38 weeks is safe. So I pushed him. And as we got through the pregnancy, I eventually did say, it's a bank holiday, you know, so should we just get the baby out before that bank holiday, because you'll be off, won't you, and that kind of thing. And but you know, so because I was pushing him, but then he was like, oh no, you know, I'll be off and I don't want to not be around and that kind of thing if there are any complications. So I couldn't get it as pushed as far as I wanted to, because I wanted it at 38 weeks bang on, but I got 37 and 6.
So here's a question. Why would you want to push it?
Because as I got through the pregnancy and the baby was growing at a rate that they were happy with, and the placenta was functioning as it should be, and I mean like we're getting very far into the pregnancy. We're probably at week 33 here,
right,
where I'm negotiating with him,
okay,
saying, can we push it a bit further? And he's like, yeah, we can. You know, everything is going okay, but you need to be prepared. We might need to pull it back as well. You know, we might need to get her out sooner, but yeah, let's go for this date. And so the date did. So I had a date in my diary that got scrubbed out, and then another date 6 days later, and that was the date she was born, 25th of August, 2021. And a couple of weeks before, he said, I really would like you to meet some of the people that will be in the room, because with Lucy's diagnosis, like you say, they needed to plan what eventualities could be. So obviously you need an anaesthetist, because I need drugs to be able to have a C-section and all the rest of it. And you need a paediatrician in the room, and you need certain sort of specialist nurses and that kind of thing. So he said, rather than all these people being in the room and you not understanding who they are or what they are, knowing what I know about you now, Laura, I think you'd probably like to meet some of them and have a discussion around what will happen on the day. Actually, I wish that hadn't happened, because they weren't like him. They weren't very good at calming me down. Right. They did the opposite and made me really fearful and anxious, because they were talking about all of the things that could go wrong when Lucy comes out of my tummy, and all of this kind of negative scaremongering almost, but that's because they're trained to give us the worst case scenarios and work back from there. And I understand that, but I didn't necessarily need all of that. At that point in my pregnancy, when I was getting very close to giving birth, it was very scary. I was already frightened, and then they were saying, she might not be able to breathe, we'll need to take her away, you won't get to hold her. And they basically set me up for all of the worst case scenarios. And then I spent the last few weeks of the pregnancy just, again, a bit like the beginning of the pregnancy, going through the diagnosis, detaching myself from the baby inside me and saying, this baby doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the doctors, because that, for me in my head, that was the only way I could deal with what might happen, because I think your natural instinct, obviously, is to want to grab hold of your baby and hold your baby. And that whole, they've done, all I've ever seen all my life is all this stuff about how important skin to skin at birth is and all this kind of stuff. So to go against all of that was so hard in my head that the only way I could do that was to detach myself again and say, this is what it's going to be like, and I'm just going to deal with it that way.
On the 25th of August 2021, you turn up at the hospital, to the ward.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience. What was that like for you?
So you go into a room with other people, other mothers that are going to have planned sections. So it's mostly people with their partners, and I think there was 2 others in the room. There was probably 6 beds, but there was only 3 of us in the room. Me being me and my consultant being my consultant, we made sure I was first on the list.
Right.
Because I was really worried about getting delayed or pushed back and what that would do to me. I was very anxious. And I think because we had this complication, he was able to put me first because other people had planned sections, but not for such serious reasons, I guess.
Right.
So that meant that, and he said, the only thing that will stop you going in first is if another emergency happens before you. If I have an emergency section to do, you'll just have to wait for me, but you will be my next section as soon as I'm available. So we go into this room, and this consultant comes to the end of the bed and says, good morning, Miss Sharpe, or good morning, Mr. Preston. I'll be doing your section today. And John tells this story better than me, but basically I just turned. I think I was talking to John when she stood at the end of the bed, and I just turned and went, no, you won't. And she went, yes, I will. I said, Dr. Gareth Waring's doing my section. What do you mean you're doing it? Where's Dr. Gareth Waring? I need Dr. Waring. And I started really panicking. And she said, okay, leave it with me. And sure enough, he appears in the room 15, 20 minutes later. Don't worry, I'm doing your section, Laura. That was a bit of a complication on the, on the old timesheets. Okay. I'm here and I'm doing your section. He said, I'm supposed to just be doing emergencies today, but I will do your planned section because that's what we've agreed, and I'm not going to let you down. And I was like, you. So, and then the nurse comes in and does all that prep stuff that they have to do, take your blood pressure, make sure clean, make sure you're all okay, and understand what's going to happen. So it's like, when you're giving birth, you have, what's the drugs you can have in your back? Epidural. So it's like an epidural, but it's more severe. Because with an epidural, I think do they leave the line in? Or it's like this, she explained it. Yeah, she explained it that it's like that, but maybe they leave the line in if it's an epidural because they need to keep drip feeding drugs. Yeah. Whereas with mine, they just give me a load of the drugs and then the line comes out. And I lie on the bed, and she was explaining all this, but this is what happened. And then you lay there and you go numb from like your tummy button down, basically, which was slightly embarrassing because Gareth comes in the room and explains he's got a trainee with him. And I was like, yeah, that's fine, and introduces us and everything. And I'm just shaking like a leaf. And John's quite nervous, although they were very good with John. And they did say to John, we've got Spotify in the room. Have you got a playlist? So he put some like 90s R&B on. And everybody was of a certain age in the surgery, funnily enough. So everybody was bopping along to the music, so that lightened the mood a bit. But he was gutted because he collects trainers and he wasn't allowed to wear the trainers he'd bought. He had to put Crocs on and he was devastated. So that lightened the mood as well. So, and bless him, he did do very well at making me laugh all the time about stuff like that and just being a bit silly. But when we got into the room and I sat on the edge of the bed and you hug the pillow and they put the thing in your back, and I was shaking before they'd even done that. I was like, can you do that? Because I'm shaking. And she was like, yes, we're used to that, and they had a couple of hands on me, I think, and did the injection in my back. And then I laid down and it all started to kick in. And then Gareth says, right, I'm going to start now. And I said, no, Gareth, you can't start cutting me. I'm shaking like a leaf. The line will be all wobbly. And he says, Laura, you're numb from the waist down. There's nothing moving down here, my love.
Wow.
But the line was perfectly straight and very neat, to the point where there was 2 occasions in the next few days while I was in hospital that midwives actually came to my bed asking to look at the scar, because we hear it's a Dr. Gareth Waring planned section. We don't see them very often because he normally does emergencies and it's quick. Yeah. Get the baby out, and he doesn't worry too much about where he cuts, how he cuts, whatever. But for me, it was a very neat little cut, and everybody was fascinated to see it. So I felt like I was on display at one point.
I will say that having undergone surgery, one of the things that you look for if they're cutting is not just the line, but also how good is their stitching technique.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because
that was it.
Because the stitching technique, and I have to say, for me, the surgery that I had, the line was just like amazing. And if you get a guy who can stitch you well, I know it sounds a bit, but these things matter because you've got to live with these scars.
In the long run, it does matter, absolutely. And that scar, can affect you in the long run. And I did have an emergency appendix surgery when I was younger that went very wrong. And I've got a horrible scar that, reminds me every day of how awful that event was. So to be able to have it planned and for him to be relaxed and calm about it. And like you say, even the sewing up process, because often if you've had an emergency section, you're not very well yourself. No. So they just want to get you sewn up as quickly as possible and get you whatever help you need.
So when you were a paediatrician in, was it classic where, when you said you went to that meeting to meet the team, and they were like, so normally you get the baby, they get a bit of a clean down and then immediately put onto skin. Yeah. And that's what I know normally happens. Yeah. Was that what they said would happen to you?
Absolutely not. No, they said because of a heart condition, she'll more than likely struggle to breathe. She'll need help with her breathing from straight away, which means you won't be able to hold her because we'll need probably to put her, to not incubate her, but put her in something that enables her to breathe easier. And more than likely, she'll need transferring straight to PICU, the sort of paediatric ICU.
Okay.
I was, as far as I was concerned, I wasn't going to see my baby. And that was really hard to deal with. Right. So that's how I dealt, like I say, that's how I dealt with it in my head, that she wasn't going to be my baby from the word go, that I would get my baby eventually.
And isn't it strange then? So at the beginning of the pregnancy, we have a sort of detachment because you're not feeling pregnant. Yeah. And then at the latter stages, you've got this potential disconnect, because one of the things that I think happened, and I don't know the research on it, but certainly women who have a postnatal depression issues and have feelings of detachment, particularly, I think there's a lot of mature parents where that can be a problem. I think right across the board, but certainly, like anything, the older you are, the more chance that these things can occur. And you were already having detachment.
Well, exactly. And often those feelings can be triggered by trauma at birth and things like that. And I had almost like, it was like planned trauma almost. Yeah. It was weird. It was like all this awful stuff's going to happen. And you just got to deal with it. You've chosen to carry on with this pregnancy. Therefore, you're just going to have to deal with all of this stuff that could happen. And that's not a very easy thing to do in your head to process that. And it was tough. But the strangest feeling was, giving birth to Lucy, as it were. It's not really, it's a strange term when you have a planned section to say giving birth, because to me giving birth is pushing a baby out, so it's a bit of an odd term. I don't know if there's a different term for it, but yeah. So for me, you know, I was planning to not have my baby and all the rest of it put on me, and it was going to be potentially quite scary that she could be very poorly, is what they were warning us. So when Gareth lifted her out and all her arms and legs went out like this, like a big sort of star, like starfish in the bed kind of, you know, that kind of pose. She kind of posed out like that, laid right back, and then just screamed at the top of her voice.
Wow.
And John and I were like, whoa, because they said your baby might not cry, she might not make any noise, you know. So John and I just looked at each other like, was that her? Was that in the next room? Like, was that?
Wow.
It was such a shock. And then they put her on the side, this kind of like little unit thing at the side, and put the monitor on to check the heart rate. Well, it's a CO2 monitor, like we all found out in COVID, you know, those things that go on your finger, check your blood oxygen, don't they, and all that kind of thing. So they put it on her toe, and the nurse, I saw the nurse's face, because she was a slightly grey colour, but that's quite common with a section because they've kind of shocked into the world. But she was a little bit grey. And, of course, I'd seen, you know, lots of pictures and done all my research and stuff and videos and things, and I was like, oh, God, you know. And the nurse sort of turned around and looked quite stressed. And then the paediatrician said, let's just try that on her finger. And she moved the CO2 monitor onto her finger instead of her toe and gave her a bit of a rub like they do. And she pinked up and she said, that blood oxygen, absolutely fine. She's obviously okay because she's screaming the place down. I'm not needed here. Bye. And I was like, no, you can't go. You're supposed to take my baby with you. Where are you going? And I almost tried to get off the bed and then remembered that, like, nothing worked from my belly button down. Kind of like, you know, sort of trying to grab her as she walked out the room. And the anaesthetist was brilliant. Like, anaesthetists are amazing people because they're the people at the top of the bed with lots of different operations, not just sections, where they have to calm the person down if they you know, if you're awake during a procedure. But they have to be there to administer whatever drugs you need to have that procedure and potentially put you to sleep if they need to and all the rest of it. So they have quite a tough job. They've got it's a balancing
act.
Yeah, and they've got to have a very good bedside manner because they've got to be kind of very calm with you, but also very aware of what's going on and very switched on with all the numbers around them. And I don't know how they do that job. It's incredible. And the anaesthetist we had was fantastic. She was a lovely lady. Like I say, she'd scared me to death when I met her a couple of weeks before. I don't think it was her that I met. I think it was a different person.
Right.
I think if I'd have met her, I wouldn't have been as frightened because she, even from before we went in the room, she came to see me in the room with the other women and was chatting to me and was really good at calming me down and all the rest of it. And she said, you don't need the paediatrician, Laura. Your baby's Lucy's absolutely fine. And John and I were just like, she can't be.
Wow.
She's got a heart condition and she needs help. And the next thing, as I'm saying all this and saying to the anaesthetist, you know, that paediatrician needs to come back. How dare she leave, kind of thing. Me being me, getting all, you know, aggy with this poor anaesthetist. Next thing I know, Lucy's plugged on my chest. Skin to skin, there she is. And there's a beautiful picture which I'll have to share. We were talking earlier, weren't we, about, you know, getting some images up of Lucy, really. And it's a very intimate image of Lucy and I just after she was put on my chest, but it's a beautiful image. And so it was not what I expected at all and very overwhelming.
And
obviously.
That bar, like any thoughts you might have had about detachment, whatever, are just completely gone.
Yeah.
And you suddenly have a new human and they're there and they're screaming. In fact, they usually calm down a bit.
Yeah, she did calm down
you know, because they feed off your...
Lucy being Lucy, she was still a bit grumpy even when she was laid there. She was telling me who was boss even then.
But so we now have... Now, there's one thing we haven't talked about. We've got to the point where Lucy is in the world. But where did the name come from and when did you decide?
It was quite early on, actually. So when we got the... I can't remember if we discussed this before, but when we got the diagnosis results over the phone, We then went in the following week to meet our consultant, who happened to be, we hadn't met, I'd met Gareth Waring because he'd done my amnio or whatever it was, to get the diagnosis. So I had met him, but John hadn't met him. But we went in to meet him and have our first scan with him. But before the scan, the nurse came in with the results from the Life Centre in like a little folder. And she said, this folder does have the sex of your baby. Do you want to know the sex of your baby? And we were like, and we looked at each other because we hadn't discussed that really.
Right.
But I think we both instinctively said yes, because as I've talked about before, having seen her on a few scans even at this point, even at like 20 weeks or whatever we were at this point, we'd seen her quite a lot of her. So yes, we did want to know. So we knew it was a little girl at that point. And again, I can't help myself. I've got such a kind of planning brain.
Yes, I know this to be true. I know this to be true, Laura.
I can't help
I know it.
Yes, I can't help myself. I needed to start planning what the baby was going to be called at that point.
Right.
And whether John liked it or not, we were discussing names. After that scan, I remember we went to the Hard Rock Cafe.
And what were the big hitters? Before we got to Lucy, what were the big hitters?
So her middle name is Amelia, and I wanted to call her Amelia.
Right.
And I think John had a different name as well. I can't remember what that was now. But what we discussed at that, I mean, we were always so pragmatic. At that meal, we discussed we knew we wanted a name that you couldn't shorten.
Right.
Because we both have names that aren't really shortened, and we wanted that to continue. And so your name is your name kind of thing. Even though people do shorten Laura, and they do sometimes to Law, and Lucy does sometimes get Lou. But generally it is the name is the name. And so we discussed that, and we discussed the fact that we knew that people with Down syndrome can struggle to learn to talk.
Right.
They can struggle with speech impediments and things, depending on the weakness of the muscles in the jaw and the tongue and all of that kind of stuff. We were taking all of that into account, would you believe?
Wow.
Which a lot of people are like, you can't have done that. But we did. We genuinely were worried.
Knowing
Exactly.
you, I know this is you.
Yeah.
This is absolutely you.
I had to think it through, and it had to be right for the baby to for the child to be able to say their name and stuff. Actually, looking back, the name Lucy was something that. So I was inspired by the Peanuts cartoon,
right?
Because I grew up. My dad was a graphic designer, and one of the first things he taught me to draw was Snoopy. It was a very simple drawing that he taught me to do, because I was always like, I can't draw like you. It's not fair, and da-da-da. And he said, so he drew a Snoopy and then showed me how he did it, and then got me to do it. And it was exactly the same. And I was like, I can draw like you. So it's obviously like a thing to sort of build my confidence, because I was struggling. We'd always watch Snoopy cartoons together and things. And I always loved the character Lucy. I thought she was hilarious. And John was a bit the same, really. He'd always enjoyed it. So when we started to sort of, wherever that came from, I think we didn't use books, but I think we went online and maybe looked at a few lists and stuff. Right. And kind of the lovely thing nowadays is you don't have to get a massive big book. You can just say, ask ChatGPT or ask Google, because we knew it needed to be quite a short name. So we're like 4 or 5 letter names. And for girls and da-di-da-di-da. And I think Lucy was in a list, and I think Amelia was in a list, and there was another name in the list. And we got a list of 10 down to like 5, and then down to 3. And then we decided we both felt this connection to the character Lucy. Wow. Because we knew we needed a fighter and somebody, a feisty kid that was going to, rule the roost as she does.
But with your genetics, I know this is going to be happening. I'm seeing it happening already. Knowing Lucy, I can see it forming.
Yeah, exactly. So it made sense to both of us. So that's where the name came from.
So, born on August 25th, 2021, was Lucy.
Yes.
Wow. Now then, We now have a baby. And then we have a whole lot more to come, which is all to do with the complications we talked about before and how they'll get resolved. And we'll find that out in the next episode, I think, which will be episode 5 of
Tea and 21 with Laura Sharpe.
See you next time.
See you then.
Niltoni Broadcast Network, NBN, popcorn for your ears.